I'd like to welcome you back to our walk through the book of Romans. Today we're in Romans, the first chapter, verse number 26, and we're going to try to cover verse 26 and 27 today. The Apostle Paul is bringing us through a digression. He's bringing us to an understanding of what happens in the lives of people who decide that they are not going to follow God. He starts out with this premise that every person knows there is a God. But when they decide that they don't want to follow God, they don't want to worship God, when they decide that they're going to live independently from God, then there comes into their lives a digression. Everything begins to go downhill. And let me just say this. This is something that happens in societies. If you were to study the fall of the Roman Empire, you were to see that it was a digression, and it was a digression because of a lack of wanting to serve God. It was because of a lack of morality. And you know what happens? Nations have been destroyed because they have set in their minds, we are not going to serve God. We are going to serve and worship ourselves. We are going to serve and worship idols. We're going to serve and worship animals or whatever. And so we need to understand that things begin to head downhill just as soon as a person says in their minds, I am not going to serve God. Now, verse number 26, for this reason. For what reason? Because they've decided not to serve God. Because they've decided to worship idols, and they decided to worship the creature instead of the Creator. For this reason, God gave them over. Now again, we see these words, and these words are used again here in verse number 26. God gave them over. What does it mean God gave them over? God surrendered them over. It's a better translation. He surrendered them. In other words, he said, you know what? Here I am. I want to help you. I want to give you life. I want to give you my wisdom. I want to give you everything pertaining to life and godliness. I want to give you all these things, but if you decide you don't want anything to do with me, I'm just going to let you go on your way. I'm going to surrender you over. Now notice what he says here. He says he gave them over to degrading passions. He gave them over to degrading passions. Now, what is a passion? First of all, a passion is a lust. It's an out of control desire. What did God do? God said, you know what? If you want to serve the lusts of your flesh, if you want to serve the lusts, actually, the Apostle Paul has already talked about the lust of the mind, the out of control desires for things in their minds and their hearts. If you want to do that, God says, you know what, I'm going to give you over. The next step is your passions. Now, passions are good and passions are bad. Passions are basically what you are looking towards, what you desire. You know what? If you're passionate for God, you know what? What a great thing. What a great thing to be passionate for God and passionate for His Word. But you know what? Here these people have said, you know what? We're going to reject God. And so what happens to their passions? They begin to get to be turned over. They're surrendered over to degrading passions. And this word degrading actually means shameful. Shameful passions. I believe that one of the strongest emotions that a person can have is the emotion of shame. Have you ever seen someone who is ashamed? Maybe they're an athlete and they've just lost a game. Maybe they were the one that they were depending on to shoot that last free throw in a basketball game, and they missed the free throw, and they walk away with shame. Well, what happens is when we decide not to serve the Lord, when we decide to worship ourselves, worship idols, or whatever our area of worship is, when we decide to do that, God says, go ahead. But then this is the next step in what's going to happen. You're going to start feeling shame about the passions that you have. And you know what I found out is people try to combat the shame by trying to reason things out. Well, I'm this way. This is the way I am. And you know what? It doesn't take away the shame. Now, what is the Apostle Paul talking about? Here he's talking about the shameful behavior of homosexuality. Now, you might be thinking, well, Leon, do you believe homosexuality is a sin? Yes, very definitely. I believe it's a sin. Do you believe that homosexuality is the unforgivable sin? No, I do not believe that. I believe that if you're a homosexual, Jesus wants to save you. He wants you to serve him. Now you're going to change. And the change is going to come about because God's working on the inside of you. But is homosexuality a sin? Yeah, it is a sin. A definite yes, it's a sin. And here the Apostle Paul calls it a degrading, a shameful sin. And he goes on in verse number 26, and he says, for women exchange the natural function for that which is unnatural. What's he talking about? He's talking about a woman is no longer wants to be with a man, but she wants to be with a woman. He's talking about here that they exchange a natural function. How many of you know that it's natural for a woman to be with a man, and it's natural for a man to be with a woman? And so what the Apostle Paul here is talking about is he's talking about a digression to a point where your passions are so degraded, so shameful, that now homosexuality is set into your society. It's set into your families. Now, going on to verse number 27, he says, and in the same way, also men abandon the natural functions of the woman. What's he talking about? He's talking about the sexual functions that a man and the woman have together. And he calls it a shameful thing. And then he goes on and he says, and they burn in a desire for one another, men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own person the due penalty of their error. Listen to me. Homosexuality has a penalty. It's not a good thing. It's a penalty because of the error. I hope that you have been informed in these verses. I hope that you join us again next week as we continue our study in the book of